Some people call my father a hero. Others would call him a traitor. But the truth? The truth is much more complicated. My name is Emma and I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a second-generation Bosnian American. My parents both arrived in the U.S. separately in the early 90s, met at a small Bosnian restaurant, fell in love and got married. In October of 1996 I was born, and for that first year of my life my parents were happy. Or at least that's what I've been told. I have only the faintest memories of my father, but whether they are real or just stories I've heard over the years I'll never know. But I do know this: everyone who speaks about my father remembers him with admiration. Even though he walked out on me and my mother. Even though he vanished without a trace. Some still call him a hero. But why? My father, Luka, was born in a small Bosnian village called Obrav, back when Bosnia was still part of Yugoslavia. My mother has told me stories about his childhood, how he grew up surrounded by mountains, forests for hunting and rivers for fishing. Life was peaceful for almost 50 years after World War II. But that peace did not last. Then came the war. A war that pitted neighbor against neighbor. When the Bosnian Civil War erupted, my mother and her family managed to escape early. But my father? He stayed. He believed his home was safe. He was wrong. At first, the war seemed winnable. The Bosnians and Croats, who made up the majority, were fighting together against the Serbs. But then the Serbs received powerful support from Serbia itself, and the tides of war changed. My father and the other men in his village formed a small militia, hoping to protect their home. For a while they held back the Serbian forces. But then the enemy surrounded them and they realized they were doomed. With no way out, my father and his friends faced a terrible choice. They knew if they didn't break through the encirclement, they would all die, and worse, their families hiding in a nearby village would be next. One morning, desperate for a way to escape, my father disappeared into the woods. Hours later, he returned with what seemed like good news. He had found an opening, an unguarded clearing on the eastern side of the village. It was their chance. At sunrise, the men of Obrav made their move, running through the clearing. They believed they were free. They believed my father had saved them. And then the gunfire started. Machine guns tore through the air. Snipers picked off the running men one by one. It was an ambush. The men were cut down instantly. Only my father made it to safety. For years, people believed my father had simply been lucky. The sole survivor of a massacre. A hero who lived to save his family. But the truth, revealed in a moment of drunken confession years later, was much darker. That morning my father hadn't been scouting for a safe path. He had been searching for the enemy. He had approached the Serbs with a white flag, not to surrender but to strike a deal. He told them that the village militia would never surrender, but that he would. In exchange for his life, he promised to lead his friends into an ambush. The Serbian commander agreed. And so, my father returned to his comrades and lied to them. That morning they ran straight into a trap he had set. He never fought alongside them. He never led them to safety. He simply stood by the trees and watched as they were slaughtered, stepping over their bodies once it was over. After the massacre, my father fled Bosnia with his mother and aunt, eventually making his way to St. Louis. There he built a new life, hiding the truth of what he had done. People called him brave. They called him the lucky survivor. My grandmother never stopped praising him. But my father? He never believed the lies he told. For years, the weight of his actions crushed him. He drank. He stayed out late. He fell into dark depressions. And then, one night, after an argument with my mother, the truth spilled out. He confessed everything. And my mother told him to leave. She expected him to come back eventually. But he never did. He drove away that night and vanished. To this day, no one knows where he is. Some say I should look for him. That I'll regret it if I don't. That no matter what he did, he's still my father. But I don't know if I want to find him. Because what if I do? And what if the man I find is worse than the one who betrayed his brothers? If you were in my father's position, faced with an impossible choice between saving yourself and saving others, what would you have done? Story 2. Many years ago, in a land far from these shores, a man stood before a silent crowd of villagers. Every eye was fixed on him, every ear straining to catch his words. When he finished speaking, he took out a lighter, flicked it to life, and let the flame dance for a moment before tossing it to the ground. The fire caught instantly, spreading in a flash to the gasoline-soaked earth beneath a woman tied to a wooden post. Wrapped around her neck was a motorcycle tire, drenched in the same fuel. The flames surged upward, consuming her, but the crowd remained silent. Not a single voice rose in protest. The woman was an elder of the village, a respected figure. Yet no one spoke up for her, not as the fire devoured her, not as her screams filled the air. Her crime? Stealing a small ball of opium from a jungle processing center in western Myanmar. She had pleaded her case, saying she only wanted to ease her son's suffering from a broken arm. The man who burned her alive had listened with apparent sympathy. Then, once he had secured her confession, he passed his judgment, swift, absolute, and final. He was judge, jury, and executioner. That man was my grandfather. For over a decade, he served as the chief enforcer for a powerful heroin smuggling syndicate in the Golden Triangle. His job was to maintain discipline through terror. Thieves, rule breakers, and runaway workers all met the same fate: shot, hanged, beheaded, or burned alive. Hundreds died by his hands, their deaths a gruesome warning to others who might stray. Eventually he realized his time was running out. He had made too many enemies, and his own survival, and that of his family, was at risk. He gathered what wealth he could, smuggled himself and his family into Vietnam, and acquired forged South Vietnamese diplomatic passports. With these, they walked onto an outbound Air Force transport plane, blending seamlessly with the fleeing politicians and military officers. They landed in America and settled in the Bay Area, where my grandfather reinvented himself as a legitimate businessman, investing in Southeast Asian-run grocery stores, restaurants, and other small enterprises. He lived that life for 40 more years. Then cancer came for him. Twice he fought it off. The third time he knew he would not win. As he lay on his deathbed, he converted to Catholicism and called for a priest. Over the course of several days he confessed his sins, every crime, every horror. My mother and grandmother listened, pale and shaking, as he recounted his past. The priest was just as ashen-faced, burdened with the weight of my grandfather's truths. One confession stood out among the many. During my grandfather's reign of terror, an American NGO arrived in the Golden Triangle, moving from village to vaccinate children against polio. To his organization, this was an existential threat. The American presence could expose their operations, leading to foreign intervention at the height of the Vietnam War. The villagers were ordered to welcome the NGO warmly but to refuse the vaccines. To ensure compliance, a warning was issued: any family that allowed their child to be vaccinated would suffer dire consequences. Yet the NGO was clever. They didn't just arrive with needles and medical jargon. They brought gifts. Basic medications, baby formula, hydration powders, and treats for the children. The villagers, many of whom had never known modern medicine, quickly realized they had been deceived. In secret, dozens of families took their children to be vaccinated. When word reached the organization, my grandfather was assigned the task of punishment. He gathered the names of every child who had received a vaccine. Under the pretense of ensuring their safety, the children were taken from their families, with promises of medical observation and compensation. The parents, desperate but powerless, complied. Days later, the children were returned, not to their homes, but to the outskirts of their villages, their lifeless bodies stacked in gruesome piles. My grandfather had poisoned them all, methodically and without hesitation. That confession haunted my mother and grandmother for the rest of their lives. I only learned of it when I expressed my desire to visit Myanmar, to see the land of my ancestors. My mother resisted at first, evading my questions. When I pressed her, she finally relented, revealing the truth about my grandfather's past. I will never set foot in Myanmar, not because I fear the families who lost their children, but because there are still people in power who remember my grandfather's name. People who would make sure I disappeared forever. He was a powerful man. He was a feared man. And for all his wealth and success in America, he could never outrun his sins. Story 3. Many years ago, in a village deep in the jungles of Myanmar, a man stood before a silent crowd. His face was calm, his eyes cold. Every villager watched him, but no one dared to speak. In his hand he held a lighter. He flicked it once and a small flame danced. For a moment he let it burn, then he dropped it onto the ground. The fire spread instantly. The earth had been soaked in gasoline. The flames rushed toward a woman tied to a wooden post. Around her neck was an old motorcycle tire, drenched in fuel. The fire climbed, roaring to life. She screamed, but no one moved. No one spoke. She was not just any woman. She was an elder, a respected figure. Yet not a single person defended her. Her crime? Stealing a small ball of opium from a jungle drug processing center. She had pleaded for mercy, explaining that she only wanted to ease her son's pain. His arm was broken and she had no money for medicine. The man had listened. He had nodded as if he understood. Then, once her confession was complete, he gave his judgment, swift, absolute, final. He was judge, jury, and executioner. That man was my grandfather. For over a decade, he worked as the chief enforcer for a powerful heroin smuggling syndicate in the Golden Triangle. His job was simple: make people obey through fear. Thieves, workers who tried to run, and anyone who broke the rules met the same fate: shot, hanged, beheaded, or burned alive. Hundreds of men, women, and even children died because of him. Their deaths were warnings to others: never betray the organization. But power does not last forever. My grandfather made enemies, too many. One day he realized that his time was running out. If he stayed, he would be killed. He gathered his wealth, took his family, and ran. Using forged diplomatic passports, he smuggled himself into Vietnam. When South Vietnam fell, he and his family boarded an Air Force transport plane filled with fleeing politicians and military officers. They landed in America and settled in the Bay Area. There, my grandfather became a different man. He invested in small businesses, owned grocery stores, and lived as a respected community leader. For 40 years he hid his past. Then cancer came for him. He fought it twice. The third time he knew it was over. Lying on his deathbed, he converted to Catholicism and called for a priest. Over several days he confessed his sins. My mother and grandmother sat beside him, their faces pale, their hands shaking as he spoke. The priest listened in silence, his face growing grimmer with every word. But there was one confession that was worse than all the others. During my grandfather's rule, an American NGO arrived in the Golden Triangle. They traveled from village to village, vaccinating children against polio. To my grandfather's organization, this was dangerous. The Americans could expose their drug empire. They could bring foreign soldiers, government interference, or worse. The solution was simple. The villagers were told to welcome the doctors but refuse the vaccines. To ensure obedience, a warning was given. Any family that allowed their child to be vaccinated would suffer. But the Americans were clever. They did not just bring vaccines. They brought medicine, powdered milk, and candies for the children. The villagers, many of whom had never seen real doctors, quickly realized they had been deceived. In secret, dozens of families took their children to be vaccinated. The punishment was swift. My grandfather gathered the names of every child who had received the vaccine. Under the pretense of ensuring their health, he had them taken away. The parents were told not to worry. Their children would be observed and their families would be compensated. The children never came home. Days later, their bodies were returned, not to their parents but to the jungle, left in lifeless piles. My grandfather had poisoned them all. One by one, methodically, without hesitation. When my mother told me this story, I could see the pain in her eyes. She had lived her whole life under the shadow of this terrible truth. I had once wanted to visit Myanmar to see the land of my ancestors. But my mother begged me not to go. She told me that even though my grandfather had been gone for years, there were still people who remembered his name. People who would make sure I never returned. For all his power, all his wealth, my grandfather could never escape his sins. Now, I wonder, if he had lived long enough to face justice, would he have accepted it? Or would he have run again? And if you had known him, if you had seen the fear in people's eyes when they spoke his name, what would you have done? Story 4. In the heart of Providence, Rhode Island, there once lived a family of great wealth and deep secrets. The Winfield family, known for their vast estates and social influence, had spent generations securing their place among New England's elite. But their legacy did not come without scandal. At the center of this tale was their only son, Nathaniel Winfield. Nathaniel was born on October 30, 1879, to James Winfield and Eleanor Hastings. James, a man of nearly 60, had long hoped for a male heir, while Eleanor, 30 years his junior, had already given him 3 daughters. Though their marriage was one of convenience rather than love, it served its purpose, uniting 2 powerful families. But for years, Eleanor failed to give James the son he so desperately needed. Then in the winter of 1879, the long-awaited news arrived. Eleanor was pregnant once more. The entire household held its breath for 9 months, for if the baby was another girl, Eleanor's efforts would have been in vain. When the day finally came and the midwife announced it was a boy, James wept with joy. But not everyone celebrated. Nathaniel grew into a striking child, but unlike his sisters who resembled their father with their fair hair and blue eyes, Nathaniel was different. His jet-black hair and piercing dark eyes were unmistakably Hastings' traits. Rumors swirled through the estate, whispers of a forbidden affair, of a child whose true lineage was a secret only one woman knew. But as the years passed, these murmurs faded into silence. And yet, Nathaniel was far from ordinary. Even as a toddler, he was unervingly intelligent. By the age of 2 he was solving puzzles far beyond his years. His vocabulary was vast, his mind quick, his understanding of human nature uncanny. But something about him unsettled those around him. He was missing something vital: empathy. One day while playing with a group of children, a boy tripped, smashing his face against the wooden floor. Blood pooled from his nose and mouth, and the other children gasped in horror. But Nathaniel only laughed. As the injured boy sobbed, Nathaniel sat nearby, calmly playing with a tin train as though nothing had happened. His mother dismissed it. His father called it boys being boys. But the staff knew better. The darkness in Nathaniel only grew. The Winfield estate, grand as it was, had a terrible rodent problem. Traps were placed throughout the house, meant to catch the mice before they became a true infestation. But something strange began to happen. Every morning the groundskeeper checked the traps, only to find them empty. No dead mice, no signs of struggle. Then one evening as he prepared to reset them, he noticed something odd. Some traps had been triggered, their bait missing. Confused, he mentioned it to Mrs. Winfield, who had a sudden, terrible realization. She ordered him to search Nathaniel's room. What he found was worse than anyone could have imagined. Inside Nathaniel's closet lay a dozen tiny corpses, mice he had been secretly collecting. But worse than that was the small scalpel resting beside them, its blade stained with blood. Nathaniel had been dissecting them. Word of this discovery spread through the household, and for the first time, true fear crept into the hearts of those who had long dismissed his cruelty as childish mischief. His mother, horrified, sought a solution. Help came in the form of her brother, Jonathan Hastings, a man who had spent the last 6 years serving overseas in the Philippines. He returned just in time for Nathaniel's 7th birthday. The moment Jonathan arrived, the household fell into an eerie silence. The resemblance between the man and the boy was undeniable. They shared the same dark eyes, the same sharp features, the same mannerisms. And even more unsettling, Nathaniel seemed to sense it. Unlike with his father, whom he largely ignored, Nathaniel gravitated toward Jonathan instantly. They spent long hours walking the estate, speaking in hushed voices, exchanging glances that seemed to communicate entire conversations. At dinner, they would lock eyes across the table, and Nathaniel would suddenly burst into laughter as though his uncle had told him the funniest joke in the world, without ever saying a word. And one by one the staff began to understand. Nathaniel was not James Winfield's son. He was the son of Eleanor and her own brother, Jonathan. Once they saw it, they could never unsee it. The familiarity, the way Eleanor acted in her husband's presence, the way Jonathan anticipated the boy's every thought. It was as clear as day. But James Winfield remained blind to it all. He went to his grave never knowing the betrayal that had unfolded under his own roof. Nathaniel, however, did not live long enough to see his own old age. At 17 he was shot dead over a game of cards. Accused of cheating, he pulled a gun in rage. But before he could fire, another man at the table shot first. Nathaniel fell to the ground, blood pooling around him. Later they discovered that his gun hadn't even been loaded. Some say he forgot to load it. Others claim he had orchestrated his own death. A darker version of the tale suggests that just before he died, Nathaniel whispered to another player that he had been responsible for violating the man's wife. The crime had occurred a year prior. The culprit had never been caught. No one knows for sure what was truth and what was fiction. The Winfields buried their past along with their name. But the whispers remain. Some secrets, it seems, never stay buried. And now I ask you, do you think evil is born or is it made? Sometimes the most innocent-seeming stories hide the darkest secrets. And sometimes the people suffering the most are right in front of us, completely unnoticed. Have you ever experienced something that, at first, seemed normal, but later turned out to be something much more chilling? Tell me in the comments below. Let's talk about it. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe, because trust me, this rabbit hole only goes deeper.